What if the highway you're driving on was feeding something? When Ross Carter took a routine late-night drive across Nevada's lonely Highway 50, he stumbled into a horrifying cycle. One built on forgotten victims, forbidden rules, and an ancient tether beneath the desert. Government cover-ups, vanishing memories, a loop that resets again and again. But what happens when you finally remember and realize you were never meant to escape? Tonight, we dive into one man's fight against the invisible machinery of horror and the chilling truth behind the rules you were never supposed to break. The static burst through the speakers like an unexpected slap. At first, I thought it was just more interference. God knows the Nevada desert is notorious for killing cell signals and radio reception. But then came the voice. Crackling, warped, but chillingly clear. This is a level 7 warning. Do not exit your vehicle. Repeat, do not exit your vehicle. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles whitening under the glow of the dashboard lights. The voice vanished as abruptly as it arrived, leaving only the low hum of static in its place. The highway stretched endlessly before me, swallowed by the kind of darkness that only existed out here, away from towns, away from humanity. Highway 50? The loneliest road in America lived up to its name tonight. The pale crescent of the moon offered little comfort, casting thin silver lines along the asphalt like delicate scars. On both sides of the road, the desert yawned wide and empty, its rocky arms extending into oblivion. I was supposed to be in Reno by sunrise for a business meeting my boss conveniently scheduled without any regard for how far I had to drive. 10 hours of nothing but highway caffeine and old Red Hot Chili Peppers albums. That was my plan. No ghost stories, no emergency broadcasts, no goddamn weirdness. And yet, here I was, with the hair on my arms standing up, my stomach sinking under the weight of something I couldn't name. My old Honda Civic hummed steadily beneath me, an old companion that had survived worse road trips than this. The clock read 1:17 IME. I briefly chuckled to myself. The classic horror movie hour. And then the headlights caught something up ahead. At first, it was just a glimmer, a faint, irregular flashing. As I closed the distance, it became clearer. Hazard lights. A lot of them. Vehicles dotted the highway like broken toys scattered by a careless child. Some faced forward, others turned sideways, as though they'd spun out or swerved violently. My foot eased off the gas. What the hell? As I crept closer, my headlights illuminated the full scene. An overturned semi-truck blocked both lanes entirely, its trailer bent at an impossible angle. Around it were several abandoned cars and trucks, all haphazardly positioned, their doors closed but their engines silent. There were no emergency responders, no flares, no flashing blue or red lights. Just a weird, sterile chaos frozen in time. The sensible part of me screamed to turn around, but curiosity's a son of a bitch. I shifted the car into park and hesitated, my fingers hovering over the door handle. My heart thudded against my ribs. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath, and then I heard it. Click, click, soft, delicate, like someone tapping their fingernails on glass, somewhere out there in the dark. I froze. My head swiveled instinctively toward the sound, but I saw nothing, only desert and shadow. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, dry and cold. My skin tingled beneath my jacket. That's when I remembered the voice. Do not exit your vehicle. The sensible part of me screamed louder now, but it wasn't enough. Against every rule of common sense, I opened the door and stepped out. The air outside felt thicker, as if it weighed more here. The faint smell of metal hit my nose, sharp, unfamiliar. The breeze carried hints of something burning far away, or maybe it was just my imagination. My shoes crunched softly on the gravel shoulder as I made my way a few cautious steps forward. That's when the flashlight beam found me. "Hey!" a voice called out from the darkness, gruff and breathless. I squinted and raised a hand to shield my eyes. The man holding the flashlight emerged from behind a nearby SUV. Middle-aged, maybe pushing into his 60s. His face was rough, weathered, like someone who hadn't had a proper night's sleep in weeks. His hair was a disheveled mix of gray and black, wild above deep-set eyes. "You shouldn't be out of your car, kid," he said firmly, his voice tight with urgency. I started, my words getting lost somewhere between confusion and adrenaline. "What's going on? Is there an accident?" He shook his head sharply. "Doesn't matter. Get back inside your car. Now, you're safer there." I glanced nervously at the sea of disabled vehicles around us. Is it some kind of gas leak? An earthquake?" The man's eyes flicked toward the overturned semi, his jaw tightening. Worse. That one word chilled me far more than any explanation could have. More movement flickered at the corner of my eye. A young woman peeked out from one of the nearby cars, a dusty Ford sedan with wide, fearful eyes. She couldn't have been older than her mid-20s. Blonde hair messy, face pale under the sickly moonlight. "Walter," she called out to the man beside me, her voice trembling. "Is it safe?" "Walter?" The man with the flashlight turned his head just enough to reassure her. "Stay inside, Katie. Just someone who showed up late." Her eyes locked onto mine for a beat too long, as if searching for something. Then she vanished back into the car. Walter stepped closer to me, lowering his voice. "Listen carefully," he whispered. "I don't have time to explain it all, and you wouldn't believe me anyway. Just trust me. Get back in your car, stay put, and stay quiet. That's the only way you'll make it through the night." His words sounded rehearsed, like he'd said them before. I wanted to press him, to demand answers, but the rising knot in my stomach suggested now wasn't the time. Something about the look in his eyes told me he'd already seen things I wasn't ready to see. That's when the clicking sound returned, louder, closer. Dozens of tiny rhythmic taps echoing across the desert floor like 1,000 thin fingers crawling over stone. Walter's face went stiff. His flashlight flickered. "Inside, now." His voice was no longer a whisper. I didn't need to be told twice. I spun on my heel, sprinted back to the Honda, slammed the door shut and locked it. My chest heaved as my breath fogged up the glass. My hands shook as I reached for the ignition, but the engine remained idling, mercifully. Then the radio flickered again. "This is a level 7 warning. Do not exit your vehicle. Await further instructions." The clicking grew louder outside my window, somewhere just beyond the edges of the headlight beams. I wasn't alone anymore. The clicking wasn't random. It moved in patterns, circling the line of stranded vehicles like a predator measuring its prey. Every few seconds it would stop, then start again. Closer, always closer. I stayed frozen, my back pressed into the seat, my breath shallow to avoid fogging up the windshield too much. My fingers hovered near the door lock switch, even though I had already pressed it down more times than necessary, as if somehow that extra click would make the doors stronger. Outside, in the gaps between cars, I saw something move. It wasn't walking. It glided low to the ground, impossibly smooth, like it didn't have bones, like it was more liquid than solid. Only brief flashes of its silhouette revealed pieces of its form, elongated limbs, glistening skin that caught the moonlight like wet obsidian, and what might have been thin, jagged protrusions jutting out from its back. My mind struggled to assign it any familiar shape. Didn't belong to this world. Then came the first real test of my nerves. A second vehicle, 2 spots ahead of me, suddenly rocked. Not much at first, just a slight tremble. Then a metallic groan as something heavy shifted on its roof. I could barely make out the faint outline of one of the creatures perched on top, its limbs spread wide like a grotesque spider. From the adjacent car, a muffled sob broke the silence. Someone inside couldn't hold it in. The creature froze, its head, or whatever served as one, twisted unnaturally toward the sound. I could feel my heart beat in my teeth. Without warning, it leapt. The thud of its impact rattled through my own car as it landed on that second vehicle. A high-pitched wail erupted from inside, quickly drowned by the horrible screech of metal and the sound of something sharp, tearing. I clamped my hand over my mouth, eyes wide, watching as the car's roof caved inward like paper under pressure. The screams inside ceased within seconds. Only the rhythmic clicking remained. The creature lingered for a moment, twitching, before dismounting the vehicle in a fluid, almost graceful slide. It crawled back into the shadows, joining the others. I swallowed back the bile rising in my throat. Walter had been right. I should never have stepped out. My eyes flicked to my dashboard clock. 1:43 a.m. Every minute crawled like an hour. Then, as if orchestrated, the radio crackled again. "This is a level 7 warning. Stay inside your vehicle. Await further instructions." The voice was the same as before. Detached, mechanical, almost emotionless. But this time it felt less like a public broadcast and more like a command whispered directly into my ear. I shivered. I glanced toward the car where Walter and the girl, Katie, were hiding. I could barely see their silhouettes through the windshield glare, but I noticed Walter's head turning toward me briefly, as if to silently check if I was still alive. That's when I saw Katie raise something against her window. It was a piece of paper, hastily torn and scribbled on with thick black marker. Even in the dim light, I could read the words, "Don't move. Don't make a sound." I gave the faintest nod, unsure if she could see it, but praying it counted for something. The next few minutes were pure agony. The clicking continued to ebb and flow, as though the creatures were communicating with each other, deciding who would strike next. Occasionally, one of them would dart between cars, its slick black body catching glints of moonlight as it slithered around the stranded vehicles. I couldn't tell how many there were, 5, 10, more. The uncertainty gnawed at me almost as much as the fear itself. And then, another noise shattered the fragile rhythm. A new vehicle rocked violently a few rows back. Someone else, another survivor, had broken. A man bolted from his car, flashlight in one hand, swinging wildly in every direction, his breath ragged and hysterical. "Get away from me," he shouted into the void. "I'm warning you." The flashlight beam shook erratically as he spun, revealing nothing and everything all at once. The desert around him swallowed his cries, making them feel smaller, more desperate. Walter's hand pounded frantically against his own windshield, gesturing for the man to stop. But panic doesn't listen to reason. The man stumbled backward, tripped over some loose gravel, and landed hard against the asphalt. His flashlight clattered away, flickering weakly. The clicking swelled instantly. The first creature reached him in a flash, a blur of motion so fast I barely processed it. It pinned him down with impossible strength. The man screamed, but only for a second. The sound was cut short by a sickening crunch that made my stomach turn. The others joined in immediately. Dozens of sleek black shapes descended upon the lifeless body like a feeding frenzy, their clicking crescendoing into a frenzied symphony of wet, tearing, and bones snapping. I squeezed my eyes shut. I couldn't bear to watch anymore. And yet, the sounds painted the picture vividly enough. When the frenzy ended, the desert went eerily silent once more. The clicking resumed, slow and steady, like nothing had happened. I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the tears hit my hands. My whole body trembled as I tried to breathe quietly, terrified that even my sobbing might draw them toward me next. Outside, Walter remained still. Katie, too. Their discipline under this terror was both admirable and impossible. How long had they been trapped like this before I arrived? The clock ticked. 2:04 a.m. I had survived 47 minutes since stepping out of my car. 47 minutes of hell, and dawn was still hours away. That's when something truly chilling happened. A new clicking emerged. Not from the sides, but from above. I looked up, slowly, heart hammering. One of the creatures was crawling directly over my roof, its thin limbs scraping softly against the metal. I could feel the weight pressing lightly down, could hear its claws tapping with rhythmic patience. Tap, tap, tap. It paused above the driver's side window, lowering its head just enough that, through my peripheral vision, I could make out the faint outline of its sharp, glistening teeth against the glass. It wasn't breaking in. It was watching me, studying. My breathing stopped entirely. Its head stilted, as if curious why I hadn't screamed like the others. Tap, tap. The sound was almost playful now. Then just as suddenly as it arrived, it lifted its head and silently crawled away, disappearing into the blackness surrounding us once more. I didn't dare exhale until long after it was gone. The silence returned, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I fully understood. This wasn't random. This was a hunt. The cold crept in as the night deepened, slithering through the cracks in my old Honda like invisible fingers. My breath formed thin clouds in the stale air, but I didn't dare move enough to wipe the fog from the windshield. The clicking had quieted for now, but I knew better than to believe it was over. They were out there, waiting, watching. The clock glowed 2:37 a.m. I didn't know how long I'd been holding this rigid, unnatural stillness, but my legs throbbed from the tension. My eyes darted between the rearview mirror and the shadows outside, constantly expecting another silhouette to dart across my vision. That's when I saw Walter. He had shifted positions inside the old pickup truck, just a few spaces away. Slowly, carefully, he pressed his face close to the side window and motioned toward me. His hand gestures were deliberate. 2 fingers pointed to his own eyes, then directed at the far edge of the road behind me. Something was coming. I strained my eyes through the frostbitten windshield, trying to follow his silent warning. For a moment, I saw nothing but the skeletal shapes of abandoned cars and twisted debris from the overturned semi-truck. And then, movement. A woman. Mid-30s, maybe older. She crept between the disabled vehicles, stooped low, clutching what looked like a crowbar in one hand. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands, her breath visible in the chilled air. I had no idea where she had come from. What was she thinking? Every few feet, she paused to listen. Her head jerked toward every creak and whisper the desert wind carried, but still she moved forward. It was a desperate kind of courage. Or maybe it was madness. I caught a flash of something behind her, a ripple in the shadows. One of the creatures slipped along the far side of a broken-down station wagon, almost perfectly in sync with her movements. Its clicking reduced to a low, menacing murmur. She didn't see it. Walter slammed his palm against the glass of his truck window, trying to signal her without making too much noise. Katie was visible behind him, eyes wide, shaking her head violently. She knew. We all knew. The woman kept moving. Suddenly she tripped. Her ankle twisted awkwardly on the uneven gravel shoulder. She hit the ground hard, the crowbar clattering beside her. Her head whipped toward the noise, panic taking full control now, and then the clicking surged. They were no longer hiding. 3, maybe 4 of them emerged from the surrounding shadows, their limbs unfolding like grotesque parasitic wings as they advanced toward her. Their oily skin shimmered under the moonlight, revealing spines and jagged joints that didn't move like anything natural. She tried to scramble backward, dragging herself across the rough asphalt. Her scream shattered to quiet. I flinched instinctively, clamping my hands over my ears even as I watched in horrified paralysis. The lead creature reached her first, slamming its limb down across her legs with a wet smack. She struggled, kicking wildly, but its second limb coiled around her midsection like a snake, lifting her partially off the ground. "No. No, please!" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of sheer terror. Her cries faded into desperate sobs as the other creatures closed in, surrounding her like a circle of wolves. One of them lunged forward, its jaw unhinging unnaturally wide, revealing rows of long, needle-thin teeth that reflected like shards of glass. Then there was silence. The rest happened fast, far too fast for my mind to process in full detail. A blur of movement, a spray of something dark, a sudden, choking gasp that cut off mid-breath. By the time the creatures retreated back into the darkness, only a misshapen heap remained in the center of the road. My stomach churned. I shut my eyes tightly, but the images had already burned themselves into my memory. They would be there forever now, no matter how tightly I squeezed my lids. The clicking resumed, slow, methodical. Like they were savoring what they had done. Walter's face reappeared in his window, his expression pale and grim. He mouthed something toward me, but I couldn't read his lips. My breathing came in shallow bursts as I wiped the sweat from my brow. The horror wasn't just the violence. It was the routine of it, the precision, the order. They hunted like this before, and they would again. I couldn't stop shaking. Another flicker in my peripheral vision caught my attention. This time, it came from my own passenger seat. The phone. My cell phone, which I'd nearly forgotten about in the madness, vibrated against the console. No ringing, no ringtone, just a steady, rhythmic buzz. I fumbled toward it with trembling hands, careful not to make any unnecessary noise. The screen lit up with an incoming text message. Unknown number. My throat went dry as I opened it. Stay inside your vehicle. Do not move. Do not make a sound. The same warning, word for word, but this time personal, targeted. A second message appeared immediately after. You've been here before, Ross. I froze. My mind reeled. No one should know my name. No one out here. Not in the middle of nowhere, hours away from the nearest town, where even cell service was non-existent, and yet the message was there, as if someone or something was watching me directly. I turned instinctively toward the windshield again, peering out into the pale desert beyond the crash site. But all I saw were the same unmoving vehicles, the same oppressive stillness. The clicking stopped. A new sound replaced it, a heavy scraping, like claws dragging across metal. I glanced up just as another of the creatures crept onto the hood of a sedan only a few feet away from my car. It lowered its head, tilting sideways, as if listening for my heartbeat. I held my breath. Then, from behind me, I heard Katie's muffled voice whispering in her own vehicle, sharp and panicked. "Walter!" They're getting closer again. Walter's eyes darted from the creatures back to me. He mouthed only 2 words this time. Be ready. For what? I didn't know. But, ready or not, something worse was coming. The wind picked up again, hissing softly across the empty stretch of desert, carrying with it fine grains of dust that danced through the beams of my headlights. But I barely noticed the wind anymore. My eyes were locked on the creature crouching atop the sedan. Its elongated head twitched, as if tasting the vibrations in the air. Thin tendrils protruded from its jawline, quivering with each minuscule movement. The entire thing looked almost insect-like now up close, delicate yet horrifically sharp in every detail. It didn't move toward me. Not yet. Instead, it lowered its long, jointed arm and gently scraped one curved claw against the car's metal hood. Shirk. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, deliberate, patient. My entire body tensed. It was playing with us, testing boundaries, seeing who would break next. A flash of movement behind the creature pulled my attention momentarily. Another one emerged from between 2 SUVs, then another. 3 now, all slowly converging toward the center of the wreckage, toward us. Walter and Katie remained dead still. Katie had pressed herself flat against the seat, her hands clamped over her mouth, eyes wide in raw terror. Walter simply stared ahead, jaw clenched, sweat gleaming on his temples. The phone in my hand vibrated again. Unknown number. They remember you. My pulse spiked. I felt my vision blur slightly, as though my brain was desperately trying to reject the message's meaning. But deep inside, something old stirred. A fragment of a memory. Not clear, not complete, but real. The asphalt. The same desert wind. Flashing hazard lights. I had been here before. But when? How? The scratching grew louder as the creature on the sedan finally slid off the hood, its legs unfolding like a mechanical spider. As it landed with unnatural grace, its head remained cocked toward my vehicle, sniffing the air with slow, deliberate inhales. Behind it, one of the others dragged something across the ground, a large piece of debris from one of the wrecked trucks. They were manipulating the environment now, changing the battlefield. They were learning. Suddenly, from the far side of the road, another door opened. I jerked toward the sound in horror. One of the remaining survivors, a man I hadn't seen before, stepped out of his vehicle. Older, mid-50s, bald, wearing a cheap suit now wrinkled and stained from sweat. His eyes were wide with panic, his mouth moving rapidly as if praying. "No more," he mumbled aloud. "No more waiting. They're going to kill us anyway. I'm not waiting." He stumbled forward, breathing heavily, flashlight shaking in his trembling hand. Walter's fists pounded against his window again, mouthing frantic words I couldn't hear. The man ignored him. He raised the flashlight and swung its beam wildly, briefly catching the glistening forms of the creatures stalking him. "Stay back," he screamed, voice cracking. "I won't go down like the others." The clicking crescendoed instantly. The creatures pounced as one. The first impact was so sudden I flinched in my seat, as though they'd struck me instead. The man toppled backward, screaming, arms flailing as the first creature pinned him down. The others closed the distance in seconds, forming a tight ring around their prey. I turned my head, unable to watch as the inevitable unfolded. His screams died quicker this time, drowned beneath wet tearing noises and rhythmic snapping of joints. The feeding sounds echoed around the crushed vehicles, mixing with the wind and rising into an unnatural symphony of death. The creatures worked like a pack, precise, organized, and indifferent to our silent terror. This wasn't mere instinct. This was practiced. When they finished, they retreated again, back into the shadows, back into position. The road returned to silence, but this time the quiet felt thinner somehow, fragile, as though any slight sound could snap it wide open again. Another buzzed from my phone. Unknown number. Not everyone broke the rules last time. Some survived. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles burned. My mind kept circling back to the impossible familiarity of this nightmare. Why did my name show up? Why these messages? I had no answers, only fear. In the distance, I noticed Walter signaling again. His hand gestures were sharper now, more urgent. He pointed toward the far side of the highway where the wrecked semi-truck still lay crumpled. Then he jabbed a finger downward toward the undercarriage. A way out? There must have been a crawl space or a gap under the wreckage, someplace they had scoped out earlier while the creatures were feeding. Temporary safe zone, a temporary chance. Katie mirrored his gestures, glancing at me with wide, pleading eyes. They wanted to move, and they wanted me to follow, but leaving the car meant exposure, risk, noise. The rules repeated endlessly in my head. Stay inside your vehicle, do not move, do not make a sound. Breaking the rules had gotten 3 people killed already, and yet, staying wasn't safe either. I hesitated, feeling my pulse hammer against my eardrums. My options were rapidly shrinking. Then, far ahead, a distant low rumble vibrated through the still air. At first I thought it was thunder, but then the headlights appeared. A faint pair of beams breaking through the darkness miles down the highway. A vehicle was approaching. Salvation? Or something worse? The creatures stirred. They could sense it too. Several of them peeled away from their positions near the wrecked cars, slinking forward toward the oncoming vehicle, like sharks detecting blood. My breath quickened. If I was going to move, it had to be now. While their attention shifted, Walter raised 3 fingers. 2, 1. He moved first, sliding soundlessly from the cab of his truck. Katie followed close behind him, moving low, crawling behind abandoned cars toward the wrecked semi-truck. They were fast, coordinated, practiced. I watched them vanish beneath the wreckage. Now it was my turn. I reached for the door handle, heart pounding, breath ragged, every nerve in my body screaming against the decision. Either I moved, or I became the next one they tore apart. The door creaked louder than I expected. Even with all my effort to ease it open, the old hinge betrayed me, releasing a sharp metallic groan that sliced through the silence like a blade. I froze. The clicking started again, immediate, sharp, Like a wave of snapping fingers in the dark, the creatures stirred, some swiveling their grotesque heads in my direction. My breath caught in my throat. I was exposed now, fully outside the fragile shell of my car, standing in the dead center of their hunting grounds. Move. I dropped low, my palms scraping against the gravel as I crawled toward the nearest vehicle, a rusted-out pickup with shattered windows. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, syncing with the clicking that was growing louder, faster. I could see Walter and Katie up ahead, both flattened beneath the crushed semi-truck, waving at me with frantic, desperate motions. The gap under the wreckage wasn't much, barely enough for a grown man to squeeze through, but it was shelter. The clicking accelerated. They had noticed me. From the corner of my eye, one of the creatures began its approach, its movements unnervingly smooth, gliding rather than walking. The glistening black of its skin shimmered under the faint glow of moonlight, the angles of its body wrong, as if it had too many joints bending in directions that defied nature. I reached the side of the pickup truck, pressing myself against the cold metal, trying to disappear into the shadows. My hands trembled as I shifted forward, inching along its side toward the semi-truck. The low rumble of the approaching headlights in the distance grew closer. The sound distracted the creatures momentarily, splitting their attention. Some of them began migrating toward the highway shoulder, crawling like wolves toward the oncoming vehicle, hungry for new prey. It was the only reason I was still alive. Walter's hand extended out from beneath the semi-truck, his palm open toward me. Closer now. Just a few more feet. I crawled faster, rocks and debris slicing my palms as I moved. Every breath burned my chest like acid, but I didn't dare stop. The creature behind me closed the distance, its clicking now sounding directly over my shoulder. With one final push, I grabbed Walter's hand. He yanked hard, pulling me beneath the wreckage just as the creature lunged. Its clawed arms swept through the air where I'd been seconds before, slamming into the side of the semi-truck with a hollow metallic boom that echoed through the night. The force rattled the entire frame. I could hear its frustrated clicking and feel the vibration of its limbs scratching along the outer walls of our fragile sanctuary. Walter pressed a hand against my chest, holding me still, eyes wide with urgency. "Don't move," he whispered sharply, barely audible. Katie lay beside us, her body curled tightly, trembling. Her face was streaked with sweat and dirt, eyes wet with silent tears that reflected the faint light bleeding through the twisted steel above us. The creature circled, pacing along the wreckage. Its head dipped low, searching for any sign of movement beneath the debris. I held my breath so long my lungs screamed. Another scraping sound. Another heavy thud. The semi shifted slightly as the creature tested its weight. For a terrifying moment, I feared the entire frame would collapse on top of us. But then, from the distance, the approaching vehicle's headlights finally swept across the scene. A large truck, a big rig, thundered toward the crash site, its horn blaring as the driver spotted the disabled vehicles too late. Brakes screamed against the asphalt as the rig attempted to slow, tires skidding, leaving long black trails behind. The creatures scattered. The one stalking us retreated with a hiss, skittering backward like an overgrown insect, retreating into the night with the others. In seconds, they vanished into the darkness, slipping behind vehicles and melting into the landscape as if they'd never been there. The highway filled with burning rubber and screeching metal as the new truck plowed through the mess of disabled cars, narrowly missing our hiding spot. Then it stopped. The engine idled, headlights illuminating the broken chaos. A man climbed down from the cab. Late 40s, tall, wearing a trucker's cap, flashlight in hand, cursing under his breath as he surveyed the destruction. Walter exhaled slowly, finally allowing his muscles to relax. "They won't wait long," he whispered. "We have to move before they circle back." He tapped my shoulder, pointing toward a drainage ditch on the far side of the road. "That's where we're going next." I nodded stiffly. My entire body ached, but the adrenaline drowned out most of the pain. I followed Walter's lead as he began slithering backward out from under the semi-truck, using the larger debris piles as cover. Kitty followed behind us, her breathing shallow, her hands shaking as she crawled silently. The truck driver's flashlight beam passed over us for a brief moment. He hadn't seen us yet, too distracted by the wreckage, but he was in danger. My throat tightened as I saw one of the creatures already circling behind him, low to the ground, waiting. Walter caught sight of it too. His expression hardened. I expected him to shout, to warn the man, but he didn't. "Stay quiet," he whispered through clenched teeth. "We can't help him." My stomach twisted into knots, but I obeyed. Any noise, any sudden movement would draw the whole pack back to us instantly. The driver paused near one of the disabled cars, shining his light through the window. The clicking returned. It was faint at first, like distant raindrops, but rapidly multiplied as more of the creatures regrouped. One by one, they emerged from behind vehicles, their shapes multiplying under the moonlight like living shadows. The trucker never saw them coming. Within seconds, they descended upon him. His flashlight fell, spinning wildly across the road as his screams filled the night. The same brutal efficiency followed, the snap of bone, the wet tearing of flesh, the frenzy of claws. We lay flat, unmoving, as the feeding finished. The creatures retreated again, sated for now. Walter finally spoke. "We go. Now." With one last breath, I followed him into the ditch, leaving the slaughter behind. The ditch sloped deeper than it looked. The earth was dry and loose, crumbling beneath our hands as we crawled forward in single file. Branches clawed at my sleeves, gravel bit into my knees, but none of us made a sound. Above us, the road was still lit by the truck's idle headlights. Pointless now. The screams had stopped long ago, replaced only by the faint echoes of clicking somewhere deeper in the dark. The creatures fed, and now they waited. They always waited. Walter paused ahead of me, lifting his hand into a fist, a silent signal. Katie froze behind me, holding her breath. We listened. The clicking had changed again, less organized, sporadic, scattered. "They're moving," Walter whispered, voice barely audible, "splitting up, searching." I couldn't see his face, but I heard the tension bleeding through his voice. The ditch curved toward a large drainage tunnel, its rusted, circular opening yawning like some rotted mouth just off the road's edge. Water hadn't flowed here in years, but the concrete pipe was wide enough to crawl through, barely. Walter gestured again, and we slipped inside. The air grew colder immediately, damp and metallic. Every scrape of my jacket against the narrow concrete walls seemed deafening, echoing into an endless void ahead. My breathing came in short bursts, each inhale tasting of rust and mildew. Katie whispered behind me, trembling. "How long will this hold?" Walter answered flatly, "Long enough." That wasn't comfort, that was math. The tunnel extended further than I expected, sloping downward with each few feet. My hands, already raw and bleeding, slipped against the slimy film coating the floor. I forced myself forward regardless, and then, without warning, the tunnel widened into an open chamber. It was some kind of old maintenance bay, abandoned long ago. A cracked metal ladder led up toward a sealed grate. Broken tools lay scattered across the concrete. Rusty stains bled into the walls like old scars. We gathered there, huddled under the soft glow of Walter's dim flashlight. For the first time since this began, we could breathe, if only for a moment. Katie's voice cracked as she spoke. "How do you know where to go? How do you know this place exists?" Walter didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked toward me. "You've been here before," he said. I blinked. My stomach dropped. "What?" He spoke slower now, choosing each word carefully. "You don't remember. I figured as much, but you were here before tonight." Katie stared at me, confused but too exhausted to speak. My mind recoiled at the idea. "That's insane. I've never—" Walter cut me off. "The warning you heard on the radio, the voice, it isn't public broadcast. That frequency isn't open. It's not even real." His eyes narrowed. "It's for you." The words lodged deep in my chest, twisting like a cold knife. The earlier texts flashed back through my mind. "You've been here before, Ross." I shook my head in protest, but something inside cracked. Flashes, images that weren't mine, surfaced like bubbles breaking through dark water. The same highway, the same overturned semi-truck, The same clicking. But there were differences. Faces I didn't recognize. People screaming. The smell of smoke. Blood splattered across broken windshields. A woman's voice, calling my name, screaming it. "Ross!" I pressed my hands against my temples, my vision pulsing. Walter stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You survived once already. You got away. The others didn't." The headache split my skull like an axe. The memories weren't fully there, only scattered fragments, but I felt them pulling at me, clawing from inside. "You were part of the first incident," Walter said. "That was years ago. They wiped your memory. They always do." Katie gasped softly behind me. I couldn't speak. My mouth had gone completely dry. Walter continued. "They buried everything. No police report, no news story. The authorities made sure of it. You weren't supposed to remember, Ross." The weight of it hit me all at once. The gnawing familiarity, the strange text messages, the precise targeting, the same stretch of Highway 50. I had been here. I had escaped once, and now I was back. But why? Why bring me back? My voice cracked, half whisper, half sob. Walter's expression darkened. Because the loop isn't complete. It never ends until all the loose threads are tied. The clicking returned outside, closer again, echoing faintly through the pipe's entrance behind us. We weren't safe, not for long. "We need to keep moving," Walter said firmly. "They'll search every tunnel eventually." He started scanning the chamber with his flashlight, looking for any possible exit. Katie knelt beside me, her voice trembling. "Ross, why you?" I couldn't answer, not yet. The faint beam of light flicked across something in the far corner. A rusted metal hatch half buried in debris. Walter pulled at it, and with a groaning screech, it gave way. Another tunnel lay beneath. He looked back at us with grim determination. "Down here." Katie didn't hesitate. She slid into the narrow shaft, disappearing into the shadows below. Walter followed. I lingered for a moment, staring back toward the blackness we had crawled from. The clicking now louder, faster, and somewhere far behind that sound, a voice, soft and distant, whispered through my mind. "Ross." I shuddered. Then I climbed down. The tunnel narrowed as we descended further, the air thickening with moisture and rot. The smell was stronger here, a mix of rust, mildew, and something faintly sweet beneath it all. Something wrong. My palms slipped on the damp ladder rungs, but I forced myself downward, one breath at a time, trying to keep pace with Walter and Katie below. The sound of the creatures faded slightly behind us, but not enough, never enough. Finally, the tunnel leveled off into another subterranean chamber. This one even older, less stable. Cracked stone walls lined the sides, and the floor dipped unevenly into shallow pools of stagnant water, some ancient maintenance system long forgotten. The air felt colder here, but the suffocating weight in my chest only grew heavier. Walter's flashlight beam cut through the dark as we regrouped, his voice low but urgent. "We buy time, nothing more. They've done this before. They'll find the lower tunnels." Katie wiped sweat from her face, her breathing ragged. "How deep does this go? Where does it lead?" Walter shook his head. "Nowhere good, but it's better than staying exposed." I stared at the walls, my pulse racing. There were markings here, etched into the stone. Faded. Symbols. Lines that formed shapes I didn't recognize. Circles interwoven with jagged triangles. Some looked like runes. Others like distorted versions of eyes. A cold shiver raced down my spine. "What is this place?" I whispered. Walter's eyes flicked toward me, his jaw tense. "The foundation of it all." "What does that mean?" He hesitated. "It means this didn't start tonight, or even years ago. It goes back much further." He moved closer to one of the markings, running his fingers across its worn surface. "The first incident wasn't even the first. Highway 50's been swallowing people for decades. The difference is, sometimes they survive long enough to talk." The flashlight beam danced over a half-buried pile of debris nearby. A broken wooden crate, weathered papers scattered across the floor. Katie crouched, lifting one of the sheets. She gasped softly. "Ross, look at this." I knelt beside her. The paper was damp but still legible. It looked like an old case file. A police report? No. It was labeled Federal Record Restricted Access across the top. The name at the top froze my blood. Ross Carter, Survivor Interview. I blinked. My throat tightened as I read the date. 12 years ago. My own name. My voice caught. "I don't remember this." Kitty glanced up at me, her voice barely a whisper. "You were here, Ross. Years ago. This isn't the first time." The pieces slammed together with violent force inside my head. My migraines, the constant sense of déjà vu, the radio warning that shouldn't exist. I had survived this before, but I was made to forget. Walter knelt beside us, his voice grim. "They bring some of us back. Always do. The ones who survive once are marked. That's why you got the message on the radio. That's why the creatures knew you the moment you arrived. You're not random, Ross. You were part of it." I stared at the record, my name blurring through the fog of my racing mind. There was a second page attached, typed testimony. I could barely force myself to read the lines, my own words staring back at me like a message from someone else entirely. I remember the rules. I remember the clicking. I didn't break the rules. That's why I lived. Stay in the car. Stay silent. Do not run. Do not make eye contact. My stomach turned as the final line burned into my skull. The others broke the rules? That's why they're gone. I pulled my hands away, shaking. My vision swam. Walter placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "You didn't escape last time because you were lucky. You escaped because you obeyed." "The rules?" I whispered. "The same rules, yes." His voice darkened. "But they never told you why the rules exist. Only that breaking them brings them closer." I swallowed hard, trying to hold on to something solid in my mind. Why me? Why bring me back? Walter's eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw pity in his expression. "Because you're unfinished." The words landed heavy. My chest tightened. Unfinished. They need witnesses who carry the memory. Broken witnesses who can spread it without knowing. Pieces of the loop that call others to this place. You've been part of their lure for years, Ross. Like bait that doesn't even realize it's bait. I staggered back, my breath short, nausea rising from my gut. Katie's voice cracked. "But who they? The government? The creatures? Who controls it?" Walter exhaled sharply. "Both. Neither. Once you reach this deep, the lines blur. The government covers it up because they can't stop it. The creatures feed because they're bound here. Something ancient, something older than this highway. The rules aren't meant to save you, Katie. They're meant to contain them." The weight of it crashed over me like a wave. I had been their tool, their loose thread, and I had walked right back into it again. A sharp metallic bang rang through the tunnel, snapping us back to reality. The sound echoed down the shaft from the passage behind us. Katie clutched my arm. "They're close!" Walter snapped on his flashlight again. "There's another way, further down." The clicking began again, closer, reverberating through the narrow space, overlapping into a syncopated rhythm that sounded almost intelligent, communicative. We were being hunted. Walter led the way, moving deeper into the narrow passage. The further we crawled, the colder the air became, as though we were descending into the earth's throat itself. Somewhere far behind us, the clicking grew louder, and then something else. A new sound, a voice, whispering, not in the air, in my head. "Ross." I flinched, nearly losing my balance on the slick concrete. Katie grabbed my sleeve, steadying me. "Are you hearing it?" I whispered, my breath fogging. She nodded, pale. "Yes." Walter glanced back at us grimly. "That's the final rule they never tell you." His voice dropped to a near growl. "Don't listen to the voices." The tunnel walls seemed to pulse as we crawled deeper, as if the very concrete breathed with us. My skin prickled, my palms slick with cold sweat despite the chill that seeped into my bones. The whispers had grown stronger. Not louder, but more intimate. Closer. "Ross, you came back. You always come back." I clenched my jaw, trying to block them out, but the voices weren't in my ears. They were behind my eyes, threading into the cracks of my mind like tendrils of smoke. Walter moved ahead, flashlight slicing through the dark, while Kitty followed close behind me. Her breathing was ragged, small whimpers escaping from the back of her throat. She was fighting the voices too. I could see it in her eyes, wide, glossy, darting between shadowy corners that didn't exist. "We're close," Walter said, but even his voice had grown strained, as though the weight of this place pressed on him too. "Keep moving. Don't listen. The rules. The damn rules. Don't leave the car. Don't run. Don't make eye contact. Don't listen to the voices." And still, here we were, breaking every single one of them. My knees scraped raw against rough stone. Every inch forward felt like a mile. The whispers changed tone again, softening into something eerily familiar now. "You left them, Ross. You let them die." I swallowed hard. The nausea twisted in my gut. "That's not true," I muttered under my breath. "That's not true." But part of me wasn't so sure anymore. Images kept flashing through my mind, fragments, incomplete. Blood-soaked asphalt, a woman screaming my name, a hand reaching toward me from beneath the wreckage, and my own voice, cold and distant, whispering, "Stay in the car." Walter's flashlight beam suddenly froze. He stopped abruptly, holding up his fist. There? Ahead, the tunnel opened into another chamber, this one unlike anything we'd passed so far. The walls were covered in the same symbols, only now freshly painted in a thick, tar-like substance that gleamed under the flashlight. Strange geometric patterns mixed with ancient runes spiraled across the stone, almost pulsating as if alive. In the center of the chamber stood a crude stone altar, cracked down the middle but still intact. Around its base, dozens of long, burnt black candles had melted into grotesque shapes. Rusted chains were bolted to the walls, dangling loosely, and a heavy metal door sat partially ajar on the far end, leading deeper still. Kitty's breath hitched. "What is this?" Walter spoke without looking at us. "Where they feed," the whispers surged again as if emboldened by the room's presence. "You watched them die. You let her die." I stumbled forward, blinking rapidly. My head pounded. Who did I leave? The answer danced on the edge of my consciousness, close but never quite within reach. Walter turned to face me now, his face drawn tight. "Ross, listen to me. This place is old. Older than the highway, older than the town. They've always fed here. Every few years they create the trap, the accident, the broken down cars, the broadcast, the rules." He gestured to the symbols around us. "This chamber anchors them. It's a tether, a contract." Katie echoed, voice thin with fear. Walter nodded grimly. "Something made with something old. And the government? Whoever covers this up discovered long ago that it's easier to maintain the cycle than to fight it. They created the rules to minimize casualties, keep the feeding controlled, keep the secret buried." The bile rose in my throat. "So everyone who dies here are offerings," Walter finished. "Some chosen, some random, and some returned." I staggered back, shaking my head violently. No, I wasn't part of. But even as I said it, my vision pulsed again. The memories cracked wider. A woman, the same woman, her face half shadowed, screaming for me across the wreckage, her hand reaching. Claire. The name hit me like a hammer to the chest. Not my girlfriend. Not the woman waiting for me at home. The woman I'd left behind here. I left her. Walter reached out to steady me. "They buried it, Ross. They made you forget. That's why they let you live. You survived, but only because you obeyed the rules, while she didn't." The whispers swirled faster now, feeding off my unraveling mind. She broke the rule. She stepped out. You stayed. Katie pulled me upright, her grip firm despite her own shaking. Ross, don't let it take you. That's what they want. The clicking returned, soft at first, but growing quickly. From behind the metal door, from behind us, from above, all around. Walter's eyes darted toward the far doorway. We need to move, now. The chamber shook slightly as another guttural clicking growl reverberated from the walls. They're here. Suddenly, the half-open door groaned wider, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into the earth's gut. They guard the tether down there, Walter growled. If we break it, maybe, just maybe, we end it. I stared down the steps, heart racing. The rules. Breaking them got us here, but breaking this might finally free us. Kitty squeezed my arm. We go together. Walter nodded. We end it, or we die trying. The clicking chorus intensified behind us as shadows twisted along the chamber walls. Without another word, we plunged into the staircase, disappearing into the depths, and the darkness swallowed us whole. The staircase groaned beneath our weight as we descended. The air thickened, dense and wet, like breathing through cloth. Each step creaked like the earth itself was warning us to turn back. But there was no going back. The whispers grew distant for a moment, but not silent. They waited, coiled like snakes behind the walls just out of reach. The stairwell ended in a long corridor, much older, carved directly into the bedrock. Rough walls bled moisture, faint traces of iron and sulfur clung to every breath. The air was colder here, unnaturally so. Walter led, flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. Even he, for all his steadiness, was starting to fray. Ahead, a door waited, heavy, old, wood swollen from decades of damp, metal hinges rusted to near demolition. Strange blackened stains ran beneath it. Symbols carved into its face spiraled inward, like eyes staring back at us. Walter exhaled, voice thin. This is it. I swallowed, throat burning. The tether. Katie shivered beside me. What's behind it? Walter didn't answer. He just reached for the handle. The door groaned as it cracked open, releasing a foul breath of cold air. The chamber inside glowed faintly, lit by dozens of old lanterns mounted to the jagged stone walls. The light flickered, unnatural, as though fed by something other than flame. I stepped in after them and froze. The walls were covered in writing, thousands of symbols layered upon one another, scratched, carved, painted, even burned into the rock. Runes, spirals, Latin phrases, some words I couldn't even comprehend, and among them, my name. Over and over again, Ross Carter, etched into the walls like a list. A record. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. What the hell is this? Walter's voice broke slightly as he spoke. Every person that's ever been pulled into this place. Every offering. Every survivor. Every failure. Katie's voice cracked. Ross, you're not the first. My knees nearly gave out beneath me. The truth clawed at my mind now. No longer fragments, but entire pieces snapping together like broken glass, realigning. The accident, the semi-truck, Claire screaming, the rules. I had been here before, more than once. Walter turned his flashlight toward the center of the chamber, and there it was. The tether. It wasn't an object, not really, more like a wound. A pulsing vertical split in the rock itself, like the earth had been cut open and never healed. A black mass churned slowly inside, swirling like oil and smoke. Shapes twisted within. Long-limbed, skeletal things pressing against the membrane, clawing, waiting. They're not from here, Walter whispered. Not this world. Not this dimension. This place keeps them fed, keeps them trapped. The rules, the accidents, their sacrifices, agreements. I stared into the writhing wound, my head spinning. The whispers returned, stronger now, overlapping like voices stacked on top of each other. But beneath them all was one voice. The voice I knew. Claire. Ross. Her face materialized faintly within the swirling black, distorted, eyes wide in terror. "No!" My voice cracked. "She's here!" Walter moved fast, grabbing my arm. "That's not her, Ross. That's what it uses. Don't listen." But the whispers wrapped tighter around my brain, pulling at every ounce of grief I carried. "You let me die, Ross. You stayed in the car. You watched them take me." The pain was blinding. No. I didn't. My knees hit the stone as I clutched my head. "You obeyed the rules," Walter said sharply. "That's why you lived. That's why they brought you back. You are part of this place now." I could barely hear him anymore. The voices overlapped in a maddening chorus. "Come closer, Ross. One step closer and you can see her. You can save her." Katie dropped to her knees beside me, gripping my shoulder. "Ross, you're not hearing her. It's lying to you. It's part of the tether. It feeds off you." I sobbed, tears burning my face. "But if there's even a chance..." "There isn't," Walter snapped. "It's bait. You've already lost people here. Don't lose yourself." The clicking started again. Not from the tunnel behind us, but from the walls themselves, dozens of them, crawling through fractures, emerging from hidden slits along the stone. Long, black limbs, shimmering chitin, unnatural mouths opening, releasing the familiar chorus of clicking and snaps. "They're here," Katie whispered. Walter turned toward the tether, pulling a small black device from his coat, a crude explosive, wires taped sloppily across a metal cylinder. "This is how we end it." I blinked, my mind struggling to realign. "What? What are you doing?" "They brought me back too once," Walter said, voice steady but hollow. "I've spent years tracking how the system works, the rules, the rituals. But there's one rule they never accounted for." He pressed a shaking thumb against a red button on the device. "No more offerings." The creatures advanced, their clicking forming a pulse in sync with the tether's sick rhythm. "We blow the tether, we break the loop," Walter growled. "But," I gasped, looking at the swirling mass, "what if it doesn't stop them? What if it unleashes them?" Walter's eyes locked with mine. Then we were already dead. Katie's face paled, but she gripped my hand tightly. Behind us, the clicking surged, and with it, the tether pulsed. The creatures closed in. Walter's thumb trembled over the trigger. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "don't listen." The air shook with their clicking, a furious, echoing chorus that vibrated in my skull. The creatures spilled into the chamber like ink across water, pouring from cracks, shadows, and impossible seams in the stone. Their slick black limbs twisted unnaturally as they scurried down the walls, across the ceiling, encircling us. Walter kept his thumb hovering above the detonator. The device blinked faintly in his palm, a single pulse matching the rhythmic churn of the tether. I couldn't breathe. The mass inside the wound writhed, almost as if aware of our presence, aware of Walter's threat. It pulsed faster, the swirling smoke within thickening into vague shapes, limbs, mouths, eyes that blinked open and shut. Watching, and through it all, Claire's face still floated just beneath the surface, impossibly real, impossibly close. "Ross, help me!" My body twitched toward her voice on instinct. My foot shifted forward. Katie yanked me back hard. "No!" she hissed. "Don't listen. You know what it is." But her voice was distant now, muffled beneath the flood of whispers spinning inside my head. "You left me once. Don't leave me again." The guilt seared through my chest like fire. My legs trembled under the weight of it. I can't leave her, Katie. What if..." "It's not her!" Katie screamed, tears streaking down her dirt-smeared face. "It's using her. You think this place wouldn't use your worst pain against you?" Her voice cracked. "Don't give them more than they've already taken." The creatures clicked faster, their long arms beginning to reach outward now, testing the air like spiders drawing closer to trapped prey. The tether pulsed, in sync, as if feeding off the moment's hesitation. Walter's voice cut through like a blade. "We're out of time, Ross." His thumb pressed down. The click was soft, too soft. My stomach dropped. Nothing happened. The explosive didn't detonate. Walter's eyes went wide in disbelief. "No! No, no, no!" The blinking light on the device flickered erratically before cutting out entirely. "The frequency," Walter's voice cracked. "They're interfering." The creatures surged. Without hesitation, Walter ripped the failed device from his coat and hurled it into the base of the tether, his face a mixture of fury and desperation. "If the trigger won't work, we'll find another way." The moment the device struck the base, the wound in the stone reacted violently. The black mass shuddered, its oily surface vibrating like water on a drum. A deafening wail filled the chamber, not from the creatures, but from the tether itself, a howl that was neither mechanical nor organic, as though reality itself was protesting. Cracks split the walls. The symbols etched into the stone began to distort and twist. Some peeled off as the stone itself groaned under the stress. The creatures hesitated, jerking their heads toward the tether, clicking wildly in confusion. Walter grabbed Katie and shoved her toward me. "Run! But the tunnel! Run!" The chamber convulsed again as a chunk of ceiling collapsed behind us, narrowly missing where we'd stood seconds before. The creatures screamed, or what passed for screaming in their language, scattering briefly before redirecting their advance toward the failing tether. We bolted into the hallway we came from, the stone cracking beneath our feet. The walls seemed to bend, the very architecture of the place distorting as the tether destabilized. Lights burst, sending showers of sparks into the collapsing tunnels. Behind us, I heard Walter's boots pounding as he struggled to keep pace. The voices still whispered, but now they were screaming over each other, desperate, panicked. "Don't leave! Don't leave! Don't leave! Don't leave!" The ground pitched sharply beneath us as we reached the main shaft, where old scaffolding groaned under the strain of the shaking earth. I barely managed to pull Katie across a failing support beam as it buckled behind us. A second later, I heard a sickening metallic snap. "Walter?" I spun back. He'd slipped. The edge of the platform crumbled beneath him, sending him dangling into the pit below. His hand clung to a warped metal pipe, his flashlight crashing somewhere far beneath. "Walter!" I screamed. He looked up, face pale but resolute. "Don't stop." Katie started to move toward him, but Walter shook his head sharply. "You go. Get out of here. Finish it." "No," Katie sobbed. "We can pull you up." But Walter's free hand reached into his coat, pulling another smaller device, a backup. He looked me directly in the eyes, calm, accepting. "This time, it ends." Then, with one final breath, he released his grip. Walter fell, disappearing into the blackness below. A second later, a brilliant flash of white light erupted from the pit, followed by a shockwave that blasted through the tunnel like a thunderclap. The tether screamed, this time in pure agony. The entire structure convulsed as sections of ceiling ripped open, walls shearing apart as the ancient wound fractured violently. Katie and I were thrown forward by the blast, landing hard against loose stone as the tunnel behind us disintegrated into a chasm of fire and collapsing debris. For a moment, everything was light and heat and sound. Then, silence. A heavy, absolute silence. The whispers were gone. The clicking had stopped. The air trembled with the last echoes of the chamber's destruction. I rolled onto my back, gasping for breath, my ears ringing. Katie lay beside me, coughing, dazed but alive. The shaft above was still open. Barely. A narrow exit leading upward, back toward the surface. "Come on," I croaked. "We have to move." She nodded weakly, and together we crawled toward the flickering light above. For the first time since this nightmare began, the voices weren't chasing us. But as we climbed, one thought anchored itself deep in my mind. Walter broke the loop. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. The sky above was beginning to turn pale as Katie and I finally clawed our way out of the shaft. Morning was bleeding into the horizon, a dull, washed-out light that barely pierced the heavy desert haze. My hands were raw, my knees torn from the climb, but we were alive. Alive. The dry wind hit my face, sharp and bitter. The sound of distant engines rumbled faintly against the silence. For a moment we just lay there, side by side on the cold gravel, breathing. Neither of us spoke. Words felt fragile, meaningless, after everything that had happened below. And then the headlights appeared. First one black SUV, then another, and another. Within seconds, a caravan of unmarked government vehicles swept toward us, tires kicking up clouds of red dust as they skidded to a stop. Doors flew open. Men in black tactical gear flooded out like an organized swarm, visors down, faces hidden. Each carried equipment that looked military, but different, designed for containment, for cleanup. I felt Katie tense beside me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. We didn't even get the chance. Two of them grabbed Katie by her arms, lifting her roughly to her feet, while another pair pinned me down. Their movements were rehearsed, efficient, like they'd done this 100 times before. "No, wait!" I tried to shout, but one of them shoved a thick black gag over my mouth. Katie struggled against their grip, screaming something I couldn't hear anymore. The world was muffled under the sudden rush of adrenaline pounding through my skull. Another man appeared, this one different. No tactical gear, a dark gray suit, immaculately clean despite the desert dust swirling around him. His hair was slicked back, his expression cool, detached. The badge on his breast pocket read only, "Federal Emergency Oversight Division." He stood over me, eyes narrowed, almost clinical. "Ross Carter," he said, as if reading my name from an internal file. "We've been expecting you." I stared up at him, unable to speak. My chest burned. "You've caused quite a mess," he continued, voice devoid of emotion. "A loop broken, a tether fractured, an unsanctioned detonation." He paused, but contained, for now. I struggled against my restraints, fury boiling inside me. We had risked everything. Walter had died for this. And yet, they were already here, already controlling the narrative. The agent nodded toward his team. "Prep them." Two men approached, carrying small, silver cases. They opened them in sync, revealing identical syringes filled with a faintly glowing blue serum. Memory suppression. I knew exactly what this was. "No," Katie sobbed, trying to pull away. Don't you dare!" One of them jabbed the needle into her neck. She gasped sharply, eyes rolling back as her body slumped. I thrashed harder, screaming through the gag. The second syringe hovered above me. "Don't fight it, Mr. Carter," the agent said calmly. "You've been through this before." The syringe pierced my skin. The world began to soften almost instantly, like my mind was being drowned in warm syrup. Thoughts slipping through my fingers like sand. My vision blurred, colors warping at the edges, but somewhere, deep beneath the growing fog, a piece of me screamed, "Not again, not again." And then, darkness. I woke up days later, maybe weeks, in a sterile hospital room I didn't recognize. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly above me, washing everything in pale blue. There was no sign of the desert, no tunnels, no tether, no creatures, nothing. Just a nurse smiling politely at my bedside. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. You're safe." Where am I?" My voice cracked. "St. Luke's Regional outside Carson City. You were found unconscious near your vehicle on Highway 50. Exhaustion and dehydration, but you're stable now." Highway 50. The name sent a flash of cold through my stomach, though I didn't know why. "Your companion is recovering as well?" she added. "Catherine Lewis? She's in the next room." I blinked. The name felt familiar but distant, like hearing an old song you couldn't quite place. "She'll be fine after a little rest," the nurse assured. A man appeared at the doorway, another agent in a different suit, smiling, approachable. "Mr. Carter," he greeted smoothly. "I'm with the Department of Transportation Accident Review Board. Just a few routine questions about what happened." My pulse quickened. "What happened?" The man's smile widened. A minor accident. You were lucky to survive. Probably fell asleep at the wheel. Long stretch of empty road. These things happen all the time. I stared at him, my head swimming, struggling to recall anything else, but the details slipped through like water. Just emptiness. He leaned closer. You'll find that trying to remember won't help. But don't worry, you're safe now. Go home. Be with your family. Family? Claire's face flashed unbidden in my mind, but it wasn't my girlfriend Claire, not the woman I thought I had loved. A different Claire, the one I left behind. But I couldn't remember why. The agent's voice grew quieter, almost sympathetic. Some doors are better left closed, Mr. Carter. You understand. I didn't answer, because a part of me already did. Weeks passed, or at least that's what they told me. I returned home to a life I could no longer fully recognize. My apartment was tidy, as if I'd never left for that business trip. The car they delivered to me was new, spotless, as if the old Honda never existed. Claire, this Claire, was waiting when I arrived. She hugged me like nothing had happened, like there was no other version of her screaming for my help in the desert that night. Her smile was wide, relieved, too perfect. You scared me to death, babe, she whispered into my ear. I'm just so glad you're okay. I wanted to believe her. I tried, but inside my head, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was hollow, stretched thin, like a missing tooth you can't stop probing with your tongue because something was wrong. Every night, I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the faint pulse that still echoed behind my skull, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. The doctors called it stress, post-trauma amnesia. Your mind protecting you, they said. The agent who visited me once more before disappearing called it graceful closure. But in my gut, I knew better. They had erased parts of me, scrubbed them clean like graffiti on a wall, but cracks always form beneath the paint. The first real fracture came one night at 3:33 a.m., the exact moment. The alarm clock next to my bed flickered strangely, as if caught in a brief power surge. Just for a second, when my eyes opened, I saw it, a figure, standing perfectly still at the foot of our bed. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, its edges blurry like static on an old television screen. No features, no face, just presence. The clicking started again, soft, familiar. Click, click, click. I couldn't breathe. I tried to sit up, but my body refused to obey. Sleep paralysis. Or something worse. The figure tilted its head, like it was studying me, observing, waiting, and then it vanished, folding back into the dark like smoke. The next morning, nothing remained. Claire slept peacefully beside me, the room untouched. Had it even happened? But the next night, it returned, and the night after that. Always 3:33, always watching. I stopped telling anyone. The therapists would call it night terrors. The agents would call it non-compliance. I knew what it really was. The tether hadn't been destroyed. Walter's sacrifice had bought us time, had slowed the loop, but it hadn't broken it completely. The contract was older than any of us, older than Walter, older than Highway 50. I was still inside it. They never let you leave. Weeks later, I received an envelope. No return address, plain manila. Inside was a single photograph, old, grainy, black and white. It showed a wide shot of the highway in the desert, taken from an aerial drone, a familiar convoy of vehicles parked near a sinkhole. Black SUVs, government tents, cleanup crews in hazmat suits. And in the corner of the photo, barely visible, a man, standing near the pit's edge. It was me. Except it wasn't now me. It was me from before. From a version of myself I no longer fully remembered, wearing the same jacket I thought had been lost months ago. A second photo was folded beneath it. This one was much older, dated decades earlier. Same site, same convoy, same setup, same man. My face. But this time standing beside Walter, both of us much younger, my stomach twisted. This wasn't the first time. I hadn't broken free. I had simply been reset. The realization clawed through my chest, colder than any horror I had faced underground. I was part of the system now, had been for years, decades maybe. The loop didn't end, it only recycled. The whispers began again that night, stronger than before, closer. You always come back, Ross. I stood in the kitchen staring out the window, heart pounding as the streetlights flickered rhythmically. Like breathing. The soft clicking came from just outside the glass, though nothing moved in the darkness. Claire's voice drifted from behind me, calm, sweet. Everything's okay, Ross. I didn't turn around. I couldn't, because suddenly I wasn't sure if she was real, or if she had ever been real. The lights dimmed, the whispering chorus filled my ears, and somewhere far below the desert, I could still feel the pulse of that ancient wound, the tether vibrating softly beneath reality, feeding, waiting for me to come back. Thank you for joining us on this terrifying descent into the unknown. Some doors once opened can never be closed, and some truths are far more dangerous than the lies that hide them. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more twisted tales of survival, secrets, and the horrors that hide in plain sight, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps the darkness at bay, for now. And remember, if you ever hear the whispers, stay in your car. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and don't look back.